Hello and welcome to the video. This video is aimed at beginners and intermediate pilots, those of you that fly foam fixed wing models but maybe aren't part of a club or don't have lots of people around you that have been in the hobby a little bit longer to show you what to do. And specifically what we're going to do in this video is we're going to fix a foam plane. Now this sadly is the Spitfire that I reviewed a little bit of a while ago. It's actually not a bad plane at all, a little bit small, and that was part of the problem that I had, getting a little bit too far away and I lost orientation, so I ditched it and it was a silly pilot mistake and I put my hand up, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. Every crash is something to either remind you of something that you're not doing correctly, or it's an opportunity to learn. The majority of crashes that I have seen, been involved in and watched tend to be the result of pilot error. Occasionally it is a mechanical failure that there was no way to spot was going to happen, but an awful lot of them are due to something that you've done wrong. So in this video what I'm going to do is repair this model and put it back together. It landed upside down in a field of corn, and the corn did manage to save it from a majority of the problems. But as you can see here, that I have an aileron that's been ripped off. We're going to have to pop that back on. Also potentially damage to the servo it's connected to. The prop was shattered. Well, not shattered really, just one of the pieces was snapped off. The spinner itself has scuff marks. That's cosmetic. Could actually get away with that. I might leave the scuff marks on it for the sake of this video. And there's a couple of little bits of damage to foam. So in this one, we're going to talk about how I'm going to get this back into flying condition and show you the tips and tricks. Now, thank you to everybody on YouTube. I did ask whether or not people wanted to see videos like this, and there was a great response. So thank you to everybody that took the time and said, yes, please. So this is all for you. Now, before we get into how we actually going to fix the model, there's a couple of things to think about before you start. First is to say, don't worry if you crash. We all do it. It happens to everybody. And you know what? Que sera. It's heartbreaking if you crash and you've spent 600 hours building the thing, but if it's a 60, 70, 80 pound foam model and you crash, it's still heartbreaking. But the good news is foam planes are relatively easy to fix if the damage isn't really bad. Next top tip is take time when recovering the model and look around, make sure that you've got all the pieces. It's very tempting when the model comes down to stomp over to where it is in the field where it's crashed and to angrily pick up the bits of wing and fuselage that you can see, and then trots back to the flight line, throw it in the boot of the car and sit there with your arms crossed looking very unhappy indeed. However, the best thing to do is to just hold your horses if it's safe to do so, if the flight line is to be controlled, or if you're just flying on your own. When you've got all the big pieces, just spend a bit of time, look at it. Have I got all the bits and pieces? On mine, things like the exhaust had fallen off one side, and there's some other pieces as well that I haven't managed to get everything back. The little rear view mirror that sits on top of the canopy disappeared, and I'm never going to find that. It's just too small. But I did spend a bit of time finding all the bits, because if you do throw everything in the boot of the car and then when you get home realize that you haven't got everything to put it back together, then you are going to have to rely on actually buying bits. And the majority of the time, as long as you've got all the bits with a foam plane, you can usually get it back together and get it flying without spending much money at all. Third bit is kind of where I started. Do learn from the mistakes. Everyone crashes. We all do it. When you realize that it's crashed, just think about why was that? What can I do better? I think part of the problem with this model was I'd incorrectly routed the antennas from the X6R that's inside. I'm going to rebuild it and put an X8R in. I find that the range and reception on those is an awful lot better. And one of the antennas I think was up near the power system, and I just don't think, as it got a little bit further away, I don't think I was having a great experience with it. The radio was starting to complain about RSSI problems and telemetry lost, and that's usually an indication that we have a problem with that receiver. So let's actually talk about what we're going to do to put this model together. Now, before you start, get all the pieces together, make sure that they're reasonably clean. If they are covered in soil or rubbish, then don't worry about trying to remove it all while it's all wet. My tip would be let it dry out and remove it with a soft brush and then a slightly damp cloth. The thing is, if you start pushing it around when you've got wet mud on a model, you can push it into cracks and crevices that you'll never get out of again, and potentially you can flush it into bearings and inside things like servos, where it's going to cause a big problem for you later on. I personally would just let everything dry, knock off as much as you can with a soft brush, and then that's the time then you can start actually inspecting the damage. If electronic parts have been submerged in water, there's an excellent chance they'll be okay, if the water isn't salty. If it's a freshwater pool or pond or something that it landed in, because these planes tend to be like water magnets when they crash, then my advice would be, when you get it home, is to remove those electronic parts if they've been submerged and rinse them thoroughly with clean water and then let them dry out. I tend to stick them in the airing cupboard for a couple of days, and that nice warm dry environment tends to pull out any moisture, and hopefully I'll get away with it. First thing is check the model over for damage. We've already identified a number of things on the model that I'm going to have to do. Going to have to replace the aileron, going to have to get rid of a bit of wrinkle in the foam itself, and I'm also going to have to replace the prop. Nothing particularly bad, but I do need to double check that everything else that I think is okay is actually all right. Just because all the linkages are still together on the rest of the control surfaces, does that mean that the servos didn't take a hit in the crash and are still okay? So I would do things like a servo checker and plug all the servos in and just exercise them and make sure that they are all right. Because if they're not, then this is the time to pull out a damaged servo and to pop in another one. Try and get the same type of servo if you can. That way that they'll react with the same kind of speed, because you don't want your aileron servos, one of them moving much faster than the other. Check the motor for play and damage. Sometimes you can't see it if the motor mount is cracked. Give it a good wiggle and rotate the motor by hand and watch the motor shaft. Make sure it isn't bent. If it is, then you could take it out and try and straighten it manually. It's blooming tricky to do. If it's really bent, then you probably want to get a new motor shaft or a whole new motor. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to repair the foam damage. So I've got foam damage here up near the nose where it's been compressed, where the nose went in. I think it actually landed upside down. And the easiest way to do that, in my experience, is to use very warm water. And I'm using very warm as a very specific term. If it's too hot, then the foam will overexpand and ends up looking like the skin of a reptile. I would always err on the side of caution, try it a bit cooler and see how you get on. If you can submerge the part that you're interested in the warm water, just do it for kind of 5 seconds at a time. Take it out and just see if it's the foam has expanded and pushed the creases out. You won't get rid of them completely, and also by doing this, if the paint application isn't fantastic or it's a decal or something else, it might float off. But if you can't submerge the piece in the very warm water, then the other thing to do is actually run the water over the outside of the model, again making sure that it isn't going to be running into the electronics. Just do it a little bit at a time, be very careful, err on the side of caution, so have the water a little bit cooler than you think it can be, because it's easier to run slightly warmer water over the area to see if it's going to bring the surface level, rather than be too hot, scald the surface and end up with that very uneven finish. I find that the water trick is much easier to do than using a hot air gun. I've used things like hair dryers and hot air guns in the past. You have to be so careful, because the difference between it looking great and absolutely looking horrific is the blink of an eye. With the water, it gives you a little bit more room for maneuver. If you find that a chunk is actually missing from the model, I'm lucky here, I haven't lost any foam, but if a piece has been pushed out, I tend to have this happen if flown into something, maybe a fence on the approach, and completely missed it up. Usually hit it with the leading edge of a wing and take a chunk out, or compress the foam and it's snapped out. Then I would use the water trick, if you have that piece of foam that's snapped out, to try and get it back to the original shape before you glue it back into position. That will then limit the amount of finishing that you need to do to put something over the top that will then get the surface perfect. If a chunk is missing and you don't have that piece, foam tends to break in very ragged sections. My advice would be to use a very sharp knife. New blades on an X-Acto are the thing to do when you're trying to do this. Actually cut the piece of foam out so it's square, then cut a replacement piece of foam roughly the same size. Always do it slightly bigger because you're going to trim it back. The packing foam that you tend to get where the planes come in is great. Get a chunk of that. Use a decent foam safe glue to stick it in, so something like goop or foam safe epoxy, those kind of things I tend to use. And then once that foam's gone off, use a knife with a long blade and then cut it to as close to the wing as possible. And if you want to finish it off, you can use a little bit of sandpaper to knock it back. And then it's just a case of popping some paint over the top. And if you do it properly, it's going to be tricky for people to spot. Last tip is if you find that the model has completely broken in half. My friend's had a couple of Bixlers that's done this, where the front of the model has been completely separated. Don't panic, it actually isn't the end of the model at all. Again, if you use the hot water trick to get as much of the deformation out of the foam as possible, then I would use good old hot glue. It sets up really quickly, and I would do kind of a couple of inches at a time and then set it up another couple of inches and just work your way around, and you'd be amazed how quickly you can get the model back together and how you can get it back in the air. It might not look as pretty as it first did, but if it's a practice plane and you don't mind the fact that it doesn't look as pristine as it first started out, you don't have to buy any spare parts. Okay, now we've got the foam bits done, the next thing we need to do is reattach that control surface. Do double check that the control linkages and the servo that were attached to the control surface are okay. That servo is going to have taken a bit of a hit. Mine's actually snapped off the servo horn, so I know there was a bit of force here that's actually managed to rip this thing entirely from the model. So I double check the servo's okay, and if need to, if you're any in doubt at all, swap it out. It's not worth, for the sake of a couple quid servo, destroying another 60-70 pound plane again. Before you try and reattach the control surface, I would always trim away any excess foam. There's these little bubbles here. Again, with that very sharp new X-Acto blade, I would just go away and get rid of all these pieces. It is going to leave white foam, but a little dab of paint, you're not going to see that. And then there are two ways to actually attach it back. First one is to use hinge tape. I'm a big fan of Blenderm, and what you do is you put the hinge in position, put it in the maximum deflection in the downward position, and put a piece of tape over the top. Then turn the model over, deflect the control surface to the maximum deflection that you're going to want in flight in the opposite direction, and then put another piece of hinge tape over the bottom, and the hinge tape should be half on the wing and half on the control surface, and that should give you a nice, flexible, cheap and easy fix. Or the other way that I'm going to do it here, I'm going to use small hinges. Now I've actually designed 3D printable hinges that use a wire from a paper clip, but these are also commercially available ones. You need to cut a slot both in the plane and the control surface itself, and you can push the control horns in either side. Couple of things to think about if you're going to be using these kind of hinges. Think about how many you want and where they are. On a small control surface, you're going to need 2. On a longer one, you're probably going to need 3, and you probably want to have 2 of those nearer where the control rod is connected to the control surface, so that it's just supporting it, and have one a little bit further out at the other end. I've got these special little knives here to cut the pockets. You want the cuts that the hinges are going to be in to be exactly perpendicular with the hinge itself. You don't want them cut at an angle, because that will make the control surface difficult to move, and it'll become quite snappy in the way it responds to the movement of the servo. So I'm going to make the pockets for each of the hinges, and then I'm going to cover the hinges in a glue that takes a little while to set up. So something like Goop is brilliant for this, or something like Foam Safe Yoo-Hoo, something that's going to take hours to set up. And then what you can do is push the hinges into the pocket on both sides, and then flex the control surface up and down, and that will kind of seat the hinge in the optimal position. Just make sure that none of the glue has squeezed out and is actually covering the ends of the hinge itself, so you're not gluing the hinge together, and then just leave it to set up, and then you're all good to go. So now we've done that, it is back together, and all I need to do is to attach the spare prop. Again, I'd always recommend balancing a prop on a model like this, and then one final check to make sure that everything's still working and the gear's okay. I'm going to swap over this receiver, and I can go to the field, and then we're back in business. If you found that video useful or like the content, then please hit the like and subscribe button down below. If you want to go the extra step, you can become a Patreon of the Painless 360 channel and help provide support for what I do here. All the videos created here are put into playlists. So if you're interested in a particular topic, have a look at the playlist, and they all are organised in there to make them easier to use. If you're not sure if there's a video for your particular problem or topic you want to know more about, then add Painless 360 to the Google search term that you're interested in, and that should find the video, article or content about the particular thing that you're interested in having a look at.